Today on the No City on the Sideline Dad podcast, my interview with David Combs, author and musician. David written lots of music for people, pleasure, and making them happy. He also wrote a book, touched many people with his touched many people with his music, especially Rachel's song. And his book, Touched by Music. Welcome to the podcast, David.
Well, thank you, Joe. I'm happy to be here. It's good. Thank you for inviting me.
Well, thanks for being on the podcast. I really do appreciate it. I know music plays a big part in your life, and obviously, Touched by Music, the name of your book and stuff like that. How did you get involved in music?
Well, Joe, I was born into a family that loved music. My mother and father both played the piano. My mother played by lessons. She learned to play by taking lessons. And my father, he kind of learned from his mother. My grandmother Combs, she was born in 1894, so she was a pretty old lady when I got to know her, but she could play the pump organ and the auto harp. She played by ear. She couldn't really read much music. Now she could read something they call shape notes, if some of your audience may recognize that, but that's an old timey way of writing out music. But she played by ear. And so I remember growing up hearing my Granny Combs play that auto harp and sing her favorite hymns and songs. And then my father, he, obviously grew up around that as well. And so he learned to play by ear. And then he loved to play the piano. So I grew up with my father. As soon as we had a piano in the house, he was always over on the piano playing something. So I really grew up in a family that loved music. And I guess it just kind of went into my DNA, I guess.
Well, it was interesting too about piano and stuff like that. And when we had the conversation before, and it reminded me of my great aunt. She was a nun. She played the piano, and today I was thinking about before the interview. I have a tape of her playing Christmas music, and I do want to digitize it. But I was thinking about something. The sound of her piano playing in the Christmas carol, especially when the Christmas season comes up, it's like having her here.
Yeah, it's a connection.
And it's the music. It's so important too. I like the sound of the piano playing. The whatever Christmas song you think of is probably on the tape. I haven't played it because I don't even have a tape thing anymore. I'm thinking to myself today, going, "Who has a tape deck? That doesn't even make sense." I'm gonna have to go to a museum just to play the tape.
Well, it's even stranger now. I have to ask people, "Do you have a CD player?" A lot of people don't even have a CD player now.
It's interesting too. That's the sound of the piano. It's just a unique sound. I like it because if I had one instrument playing in the world, which I would love to learn, it would be piano because it's just the sounds of the keys.
Mm-hmm. I think the tones, that crystal clear tone, is sometimes you can walk over the piano and I'll just play one note and just listen to that note as it fades away. And it really is music, just even if it's just one note. It just has such a beautiful tone, and then you add the harmony, the notes that go with it in a beautiful chord progression or whatever. It's just a beautiful, soothing, it really kind of goes into your body and just like a wave washes over you and you just relax.
What's interesting to you mentioned about your dad was influenced you about being playing music. How did he influence you?
Well, I think mainly just by seeing and hearing him play the piano so often around the house and anywhere we would go as a family. If there was a piano anywhere around, Daddy would migrate over to that piano and sit down and he'd sit down and play something. Even if it was in a museum where you weren't supposed to play the piano, sometimes I'd hear my daddy over there at the piano, and then the docent or somebody would have to come over and say, "Oh, sir, you're not supposed to be playing that piano." But anyway, he just loved to play and sing, and music was a big part of his life. And I think that influence just kind of passed on to me, and I feel the same way, that life without music would be really, really dull.
What has been your journey so far into music? Did you play the piano as a kid, or what was your journey?
Well, like most kids, when you're 7 or 8 years old, you start taking some piano lessons, which I did. And I had some wonderful piano teachers that, taught me the basics of learning to read and play some music. So I did that for a couple of years. And then our family moved to Florida for a year, and I kind of dropped out of my piano lessons at that point. But when I came back to Tennessee, where we were living, I picked back up and took a few more lessons. But mainly, I learned from being around other musicians. And I'm sure you've heard of these people that have jam sessions at a house or something. They all bring your instruments and they'll sit around and play. And so I had a lot of friends who were musical, and sometimes I would tag along with them to some of these Friday night jam sessions. And so you get inspired to, well, how do they know how to do that? So I did a lot of research. I'm a pretty analytical person. So I bought a book of theory about how do you construct chords? What are chords and how do they relate to each other? And I taught myself that so that I knew what a C chord was all made up and so forth. And then learning the chords and chord progressions, and I play a guitar a little bit too. And you got to learn to play chords if you're going to play a guitar. So that was kind of the foundation for my music. And then I was active in my church choir. I sang in the choir as soon as my voice changed to the level where I could sing with a constant level. And so I loved that. And then eventually, as I progressed to learn how to play the piano, I would occasionally get to play the piano as part of a church worship service. Now, when you're playing along with people who are singing or with an organist who's playing, you can't do like you do at home. When you make a mistake, you stop and back up and start over. You just got to keep going. So it kind of forces you to be better and to stay in tune with and listening to what other people are doing and playing. So I kind of grew up and my music developed as I got involved with other musical events. I sang in the university choir at ETSU when I was in college. Mm-hmm. And I ended up directing my church choir at home in Erwin, Tennessee, for my last 2 years in college. So music has kind of stayed part of my life, even when I graduated from college and came to Winston-Salem to work for Western Electric at the time as a computer programmer. It wasn't too long to where I found a church here locally that needed a part-time minister of music. So I became a choir director again, still keeping involved with music. And so really it's just been a journey with me and a progression of keeping my music active in my life, no matter what my business career direction went.
One thing interesting too is you explore your love for music and stuff like that. What are some, is there anybody, any naysayers, or there was a lot of positive people saying, hey, go for your dreams?
Well, it weren't so much naysayers as I was thinking. I wrote Rachael's song that we'll talk about in a little bit, I guess. I wrote that song in 1981. Well, in 1981, I was 34 years old. And then that was the first song that I ever wrote. And thinking back, I can never remember anyone ever telling me, you can write a song. And it never really occurred to me. In fact, the idea of writing a song really never entered my mind at all, because nobody had really encouraged me or said that you could. They didn't say I couldn't, but they didn't say I could. Sometimes just a word of, hey, you can do that. Or little kid, you can become a good long distance runner because you're good at running, or whatever you want to do to encourage a kid. You never know where those words are going to land and really mean something to that kid in the long run. So I never had any discouraging words about my music, but I never had any that were really saying, hey, Dave, you can be a famous songwriter or something. That never occurred.
Well, it's like something maybe you had to self-motivate yourself, like just something you really love to do and really enjoy. Like that song you wrote about, Rachael's song. How did that come about?
Well, it was one of those things where, and I'm sure your songwriting audience of those that will identify with this, that I sat down at my piano one evening and I started just playing a song on the piano, just making something up, not really intending to write a song or to copy anything else, but I just played this song. And it was if that song that I was playing had already existed for 1,000,000 years. I was just playing it again. And it really never occurred to me that what I had just played was a brand new song, until my wife came home from work a few days later, and she says, "What is the name of this tune that I have stuck in my head all day long? I've been humming, I've been humming this song, and it's stuck there." And she hummed a little bit of it, and she said, "What's the name of this?" I said, "It doesn't have a name." And she says, "What do you mean it doesn't have a name? You play it on the piano all the time." I said, "Well, it's just something I made up." And she's got all, she's, "You made that up?" "Oh, yes." "Well, have you written it down?" "No, it's up here." And she said, "Well, something might happen to you. A truck might run over you and that song would be gone. So you better write it down." So sure enough, I wrote down the melody and the chords and put it on a piece of paper and stuck it in the piano bench. Well, that was in 1981. A couple of years later, some good friends of ours had a little baby girl, and they asked Linda and me to be her godparents. Her name was Rachael. So at her christening service, we're sitting there and the service is going on. The preacher's doing his thing. And then toward the end, I whispered to Linda, I said, "Do you think I could play that little song that I've been playing that we've been trying to think of a name for?" And she said, "Well, I think so." So I went up and asked the family and the preacher if it'd be all right if I played this song. They had a beautiful grand piano up in the front of the church. So they said yes. And so I walked over to the piano, sat down at the keyboard and started playing. And next thing I know is the tears are starting to run down my cheeks. And I hear in the audience some sniffling, people are getting emotional about this. And so when I finished playing the song, even before the notes completely died away, I looked up and there was little Rachael in the arms of her mother. And I said, "Well, from now on, this song will be called Rachel's Song in her honor." And I promise you that it just fit. It was perfect timing, perfect fit. And still to this day, I think it's just the perfect name for that song.
Wow, that's amazing because the kid, it's cool being song named after you and stuff like that. But I had a chance to listen to your song a couple times today before the interview and stuff like that, and it brings back a lot of memories of like my aunt we talked about in the beginning and stuff like that. But it's relaxing. It's relaxing. How did you go about recording the song?
Well, now that it had a name, we kind of relaxed a little bit, and then my career at Western Electric and AT&T had progressed to where I was traveling a lot, and one of the places that I had to travel to was Nashville, Tennessee. Well, Nashville is called Music City, USA, and it earns its reputation. There must be 300 or 400 recording studios there, and it's music everywhere. And so my wife, Linda, says, "Well, Dave, while you're in Nashville, why don't you find a studio and a musician? Let's get a demo recording made of Rachel's song, something we can have, or we could give a copy to Rachael and her family." And I said, "Okay." So one evening when I was in Nashville, I was driving around Music Square trying to find a studio, and it was about 6:30, 7 o'clock, and everything looked like it was closed. As we say down south, they roll up the sidewalks at 5:30. So, but I rounded a corner on Roy Acuff Place, and there was this barn-looking building, like a log cabin barn thing, with a water wheel out front, and the sign that said "The Music Mill." I said, "That sounds promising." So I pulled in the parking lot, looked in the door. There was a man sitting at a desk. So I knocked on the door, and he came to the door and opened it, unlocked it, and let me in. He says, "I'm George Clinton. Can I help you?" And I said, "Sure, I'm Dave Combs, and I've written a little song, and I'm looking for a studio." And about the time the words got out of my mouth, I'm looking around the room, and here's Glenn Campbell, and here's the Forrester Sisters, and here's Alabama, and here's a bunch of gold and platinum records framed. And I realized that I'd probably said a dumb statement there. And George says, "Well, son, you're in one." So I said, "Well, George, I've never been in a studio." And he said, "Would you like a tour?" I said, "Sure, I'd love a tour." So he showed me around the place, and I was blown away by all the technology and what all they can do in the recording studios with the equipment. And it turned out, that I said, "How much does this place cost to rent?" And he says, "Well, it's $125 an hour plus engineer." I said, "I must have looked downtrodden." So he said, "Don't worry about it." He said, "The guy, Harold Shedd, that owns this, he owns a little studio across the street, and it's $15 an hour." That's my speed. That's my speed. And I said, "Well, one other thing, I need a piano player to play my song on my demo. And you have anybody you could recommend? And he thought for a second or two, and he said, yes, I do. I believe it. His name's Gary Prim. Well, he looked up his phone number and wrote it down on a piece of paper and gave it to me. And so I profusely thanked him, got back in my car and went back to the hotel. I picked up the phone, called Gary, and got his answering machine. And I left a message, and he called me back in about 30 minutes. And he said, this is Gary Prim. What can I do to help you? I told him what I needed and so forth. He said, oh, I can do that. And I said, great. What do you need me to do? He said, well, just send me a tape recording of you playing it so I'll know what it sounds like, and a lead sheet. And I said, what's a lead sheet? I was, again, showing my ignorance of the Nashville music business. And so he said, oh, it's just the chords and the melody written out on a piece of paper. I said, oh, I've got that. I just didn't know what to call it. So I said, I'll send it to you. And he said, well, give me a couple of weeks and we'll work up an arrangement and meet you at the studio, that little studio that George talked about. So sure enough, 2 weeks later, meet Gary Prim at 6 o'clock at this little studio. And he comes in and he sits down at the little piano and plays my song. And I'm back in the control room with the engineer listening to this. Mm-hmm. And Joe, I am blown away by what I hear. If you've ever had an experience to go into a recording session with any professional musician, you're just amazed at the quality of music that these people can create. And especially when you're listening there to your own song being played. Oh, it just blew me away. Well, he played it on piano. And then he set up his synthesizer and he said, I think I need to add some strings and some horns and some electric piano. So he was going to do some multi-tracking. So he did all that. And in about 45 minutes, he was done with all of his multi-tracking and playing and everything with my song. And then the engineer, of course, mixes all that down and masters it to a 2-track stereo. And Gary and the engineer and I are in the studio listening, and I just cannot believe my ears. This sounded as good as anything I'd heard on the radio. You know, when you hear a hit song on the radio, you just know that's going to be a hit. Well, that's how I felt about this song. Even though I had written it, I couldn't believe what I was hearing was something that I started out with just a simple little melody. So anyway, long story short, that song, just getting it recorded, just absolutely blew me away.
What kind of response have you got from the song?
Well, of course, it started with blowing me away, and then everybody I played it for was also equally touched by that music. You know, you heard it for the first time today. I'm sure that you can recall very vividly the emotions and the feeling you had listening to that song, especially if you listen to it through a headset or some environment where you really are listening to the detail and the nuances of the song. And so I did get it played on a radio program. And the first time it got played on the radio, it was a live performance, or a real call-in radio kind of show. And the station manager called me after it got played, and he said, Dave, I don't know, I've been in radio for many years, and this has never happened to me. He said, when Rachel's song got played on the radio, he said, our phone bank just locked up. He said, people were calling in. Hey, what was the name of that song again you just played? Would you all play that again? And tell me more about this Combs guy from Winston-Salem. Well, he was just blown away. And his response and the audience's response was also a kind of a light bulb moment for me. Like, well, maybe I do have something really great here. And so I need to get it out on more radio stations. So I worked really hard finding other easy listening stations. And in my book, I tell some of the stories about how I went about getting radio stations. I did a lot of what Loretta Lynn did when she was finding radio stations to play. I went around, I'd look for a radio tower, and I'd chase down that radio station and hand them a record and say, here, play my record. And by dog, they did. So I eventually got it played on all of the easy listening radio stations in the United States and in the country of Australia, of all places. So it it went wild everywhere.
That's interesting. All in Australia too?
Yeah, we had a friend, Linda met a guy that worked in Australia when he was visiting in North Carolina, and we got acquainted with him, and he loved the song, and he took it back to Australia with him. And turns out he was in the media business.
Oh,
And
wow.
he gave the record, back then it was a 45 record that I had of it. He gave it to a local radio station, and they played it. Well, they played it, and the same thing happened in Greensboro with the radio station that first played mine. Everybody wanted to hear it again. Well, they played that song every day on that radio station for 2 years. It was the #1 requested instrumental in the country of Australia.
How did that make
So
you feel?
again, just very humbling experience to, like, my goodness, this song is truly a gift. Not just a gift, but it's a gift that I am expected to do something with, not just to hide it. So I felt more strongly that I needed to get this song out there. And so we started trying to figure out ways that we could actually sell the CDs and cassette tapes around the country. And that's another whole story of how that took place.
But it's interesting too nowadays, where all the things streaming and stuff like that. It's not like they used to be selling cassettes and CDs and stuff like that, and trying to get them shipped around the world or around the country and stuff like that. But what was your wife's response from all the success of the song?
She was probably my #1 promoter, keep me pumped up, and making sure that I didn't get down in the dumps. Because, for example, when I would take my cassettes or my CDs to a record company store and try to get them to agree to carry my music in their store, I would get nowhere. They'd say, "Oh, instrumental music, we don't sell much of that. We can't do anything for you, and there's no future for this," or whatever. And so they were very discouraging. So Linda, I'd come home and tell her, and she said, "Dave, don't pay any attention to them. This song has a mission of its own, and if that doesn't work, we'll find some other way." And so she was my chief encourager, and a lot of the ideas that I come up with of how to sell and promote my music or present it to people, Linda is behind that. She is a wonderful, exceptional person of her own. We need to probably do another whole podcast about my wife, Linda.
Well, it's nice having a positive influence and a positive cheerleader in your corner too, especially when, like you said, when the times get a little bit difficult, because not every day is sunshine and rainbows. There's some days that kind of okay.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Well, it's interesting too. Also, have you got a response from anybody besides radio people, and about response from fans from the music or the song?
Well, I'm glad you asked that, because in 1994, one of my fans who, and by the way, these people that heard it on the radio would track me down, and I would start getting something I'd never gotten in my life, and that's fan mail. So I started getting some fan mail from people from these radio airplay. And one of the fans that called me was a lady who turns out to be a writer for Guideposts magazine.
Oh, wow.
She asked me being a writer, as you know, being an interviewer, you love to ask questions. You just one question after another. Well, this lady, her name is Roberta Messner, dear friend. She kept asking me about my story. How did I, what I've just been talking about? How did I write Rachel's song? All this, and then the more I told her, she said, Roberta says, "Dave, I think this would make a great story to go in Guideposts magazine. And I write for them, and I think that if you'll let me pitch that story to them, I'd be happy to do that." Well, I said, well, sure, go for it. So she pieced together the pitch for the story and pitched it to Guideposts, and the editor said, "Wow, we want to do this." So she calls me back and said, "Dave, they want to do the story, so let me help you write it." And so she did, and in September of 1984, this Guidepost magazine came out, and on page 30, a story called Two-Part Harmony. And I don't really see it very well there on the screen or not, but it's me and sitting at the piano, and it tells the story of Rachel's song, a lot of what I've just told you about. And it talks about this song growing and my business growing to where I was actually able to quit my job, a well-paying job at AT&T, and do nothing but my music full time. So that story hit the street in September of 1984. Well, this little magazine, Guidepost, which is wonderful, and it's still around, of course, goes to a subscription base of 3 million people.
Wow.
Well, yeah,
That's a lot of people.
that's a lot of pen. You being in the media business, you know that's a lot of ears and eyes and people. That is a bunch. Well, fortunately, in the back of the magazine, when they published the article, they do a little section for about the author, and it says if you want to find out more about Dave Combs and his music, here's his address. You can write, and here's his 800 number if you want to call him. And his cassettes are $10, and his CDs are 14, whatever. And so they put that in there. Well, thank goodness they did, because within 2 weeks of that little magazine hitting the street, my phone started ringing, my 800 number.
Mhm.
And Joe, it didn't stop ringing. I mean, you could put your hand on the receiver and pick it up. Somebody's there. Hello, can I help you? And somebody wants to order the music or tell me their story. And then you put it down, ding-a-ling, right again. I had to hire 2 people, 2 ladies, to do nothing but answer the phone solid for like a month. And then in 2 weeks' time, my mailman came dragging my mail down the driveway in a canvas bag. I got over 10,000 letters with most of them had a $10 check in them for a cassette. And they came to me, and my mailman was astonished. He says, Dave, what in the world have you done to me? He said, I can't even pick this bag up.
Well,
And
there's
so,
one interesting question I had about that. You mentioned something about leaving your job from AT&T and doing the music you love. How did that make you feel? I was kind of curious about that.
well, I guess, I think I'm a serial entrepreneur. Even though I worked for 22 and a half years for AT&T, I've always been thinking about, I'd love to do something I'd love to be my own boss and have my own business, my own products, do my own thing. But I never had anything that would generate enough income to allow me to do that. And when I started with my music business with Rachael's song, and I wrote more music and produced my first CD, and then that went really well. And then I did another CD, which was actually a Christmas album of Gary Prim performing that album. And that did real well. And then I wrote enough music by that time to do another CD called Beautiful Thoughts. And that did real well. And it just kept getting better and better and better. And by 1992, my income from my music sales through CDs and so forth, cassette tapes, far exceeded what I was making at AT&T. And I'm no dummy. When when I see numbers that finally get like this, and finally the music is way up here, I said, okay, now maybe it's time. Now, I wasn't going to jump off the ship, when things were I wasn't sure what was going to happen. So I did both for many years. And it wasn't until 92 that I was able to do my music full time. And I did nothing but my music then, my wife and I both, for 10 years. And so and we made a very good living at it. We probably, I know the music was, my fan base grew to over like 35, 40,000 people. And I heard from 50,000 people writing me letters. And so it was just a gratifying experience that grew from that one song to finally being able to quit my job.
Well, man, it had to be a cool experience. I'm thinking to myself, going, "Wow, if I did this podcasting full time and made enough income to leave my other job, it would be a great experience, and it'd be relief, and it'd be so much like I just imagine that was an awesome experience."
Well, the feeling that you have when you look at you look around and say, well, this, I don't have a boss anymore, and whatever's going to, and that's not no reflection on my previous bosses. I loved my previous bosses, but when you look around and you are the focus of the enterprise that you're trying to build, whether it's a podcast, and I can identify with that. You would love to have, a subscribership to your podcast to where you command a bunch of advertisers that would just be knocking on your door to advertise for you. And your income would be, far superior than your expenses that you need. And you'd say, well, I can quit my job and do what I love to do. And so the gratification is really tremendous. And anybody who's an entrepreneur or has an entrepreneurial spirit about them, I think that's kind of what drives you and says, I got to make this work. And doing this is fun. It really is fun to build a business. And in the process, for example, I had a full-time employee working for me for many years. And so I was able to provide a very good living for not just me and Linda, but for another person. And for people in small businesses, they know what I'm talking about with their employees, how they feel about providing them and their families with a good livelihood. It's a good feeling.
Well, it's interesting too. It doesn't seem like work. When you love what you do, enjoy doing what you do, it doesn't seem like work.
Exactly. Yes.
I remember, I'm a Patriots fan, and I understand they had an interview with Bill Belichick, and he's like, "This is fun. This is fun." Right? And that guy is a workaholic and he's workaholic, so he enjoyed what he's doing. I'm just saying, if you love what you're doing, it doesn't seem like work.
Nope, that's right. Yeah, you see these guys that just eat, sleep, and drink this, and I have come to know a friend. You probably know him in the sports world, James Brown, JB, they call him.
Mm-hmm.
Well, JB and I have talked several times, and he's a person. He just loves sports. He gets up in the morning and his mind is on statistics and players and how am I going to call this on Sunday with the NFL and whatever. James is, and he's a wonderful. He actually is a minister, and he
Oh
is just
wow.
a wonderful person. But he loves football, and he loves doing what he does. And I know there are a lot of people like that they're not just working because they have to. They love what they're doing.
Well, interesting too. It's probably a good transition. Is talk about your book, Touch by Music. What if somebody? I was going to pick up the book today. Who's the book for?
Well, there's really kind of a double audience, probably several audiences here, but one is for people who, and I have my Rachael song has been played millions of times around the world, so I know there are literally millions of people who may not know the name of the song, but they've certainly heard it on the radio or on Pandora. It's played hundreds of thousands of times on the internet.
Mm-hmm.
And so for those people that never knew the backstory to Rachael's song, that book's for them. They can see who wrote the song, what was the impetus for it, a little bit interesting stories, and so forth. And then there's another group that are people in the music business who are budding songwriters or people who have written something and need some encouragement to, well, can you really make a living or can you make a go at something? And so I've got stories in my book that talk about, how the persistence and all the things that it takes to make a success of something. That it's not a straight line, and it's not always, as you said, there are all bumps in the road. You run into something, you figure, well, I'll go around it, or I'll over it or under it. So for those that are entrepreneurs, I think it's a good book on lessons of how to take something and get it out there. And I think that's the exact words that even Jack Canfield said he wrote the foreword to my book. And he said, getting it out there, this is a primer for how to do that. And then there are people that need some inspiration, that like read inspiring stories. Maybe they're a little down in the dumps and they just need something to make them feel good. They're tired of getting beat up turn on the evening news or whatever. It's nothing but bad news.
Mm-hmm.
And so they need something to just sit down with a good book. And there's nothing better than reading a good book. I think you'd probably agree, Joe, that
Oh yeah, definitely.
it just, when you read a good book, you just feel good. And you've inspired yourself to do something better. And so for those people, that's also what the book is written for, is to make them feel good about themselves and maybe get a laugh or two and maybe even a tear or two about some of the stories that are touching. But that's kind of the audience. And with those 50,000 people that wrote me all these touching letters and notes, this is kind of a tribute to them as well, because I put a fair number of them in the back of the book in chapter 21 of their little notes and stories. But so there's lots of little audiences that I think it's written for, but it was a way for me to go beyond just the music and tell my story.
Well, you say inspirational stories. Anything you can share? Maybe a story from the book.
Well, let's see. One of those that I think that's really, really touching to me is a story of a young couple who had their first child. They went to the hospital, and the child was born, and unfortunately, the child died at childbirth. And so you can imagine the heartbreak of losing their first little baby girl in the delivery room. So on their way home from the hospital after the woman was released, she and her husband were driving in the car home, and they were so sad. I mean, you can imagine the contrast, expecting to come home with a beautiful baby girl and really coming home with an empty back seat with no child. And so that sorrow was really weighing heavily on them. And they were Christian people. They had prayed to God to help them get through with this. And as they were on their way home, on the car radio, they had the car radio on, and on the radio comes this song with no words. It's just an instrumental. And as soon as it starts playing, they look at each other and say, "That sounds like our little Rachel telling us everything is going to be okay." They just both felt that this song was talking to them, that their deceased little daughter was telling them, "I'm okay." And so their tears are running down their cheeks, of course. And when the song finished playing, the DJ came on the radio and said, "You've been listening to the music of Rachel's song."
Oh, wow.
I mean, it still gives me chills. I hardly can tell that story and without choking up, because you can imagine the feeling that because they had just said that and they didn't know the name of the song. And so they tracked me down and they bought a copy of the CD or the tape or whatever. And it was like 15 years later, I get this wonderful letter in the mail from this couple thanking me for writing Rachel's song. I guess it took them 15 years to get up whatever it takes to write that kind of letter. And so they told me this wonderful story. I didn't know about this story until they wrote me and said how much my music, and said every time we listen to Rachel's song now, we feel like that we're in connection with our little Rachel up in heaven. And so that's the kind of stories that I got boxes full of here in the basement of my house. It's so touching, and I just like to share those.
Well, when you have an opportunity, when you're having a kind of a off kind of day, it's probably nice to go down there and maybe read a couple of those too.
Oh yes. I mean, I have a lot of them. The lady who worked for me, she would take my letters and she'd put them in two stacks. One stack that when she'd hand them to me would have a Kleenex attached to it. Well, you know what that meant. You better get prepared for a tearjerker when you read this one. So, but anyway, she took the most special letters and put them in scrapbooks for me. And I have literally 23 big scrapbooks full of these letters that she's put in there for me. So anytime I want to boost up and feel really good about things, I just pull out any one of those scrapbooks and just start reading. And 2 hours later, I'm still reading. It's just, they're just really touching your heart.
Well, it sounds like Rachel's song is a very special song for people. And I had an opportunity to listen to it, and brought back memories of my aunt and stuff like that. So thank you for that song. I really do appreciate it. Well, final thoughts, wrapping up. Anything you want to leave with the audience, in the sense that anything you want to leave with people about, inspire them to live their dream and go for it, or anything we might have missed?
Well, I think that's the main message that I want to try to get across with not only my music, but my new book. I would encourage people to go get it and read it. I'm not trying to just promote my book. I know from personal feedback that they will be blessed when they read the book. I have had the people who read this book early on just told me that this is going to be something really, really special to people. So I encourage people who love music and love inspiring stories, get a copy of the book and share it with your friends and relatives and so forth. And I really hope and pray that it will truly bless you. And I know when you get this and go and get your Rachel song from iTunes or Spotify, or listen to it on or Amazon.com, wherever you get your music, listen to the music and listen to it in a quiet, peaceful environment where you can pay attention to close your eyes and just let the music enter into you. And I know that you will be blessed. Your heart rate will probably go down. Your blood pressure may go down, and you may find some peace and relaxation. And that's what my plea is, and I hope the hope is for me, for my book and my music.
Well, also, then where they can connect you, where they can find your book. Which you have a website or anything where they can connect with you?
Yes, it's very easy. combsmusic.com, COMBS music.com. And on there, on the first page, you'll see my book and my CD of Rachel's song. And if you click on those, that'll take you right to Amazon.com, where you can buy the book. And the book's available in paperback and in Kindle, in ebook, for those of you who like to read on a Kindle. And it's also available if you like, if you get homesick for a North Carolina, Tennessee accent, I encourage you to get the audio book, because I spent 8 hours reading this book. I am the narrator of the audio book, so you can hear me reading my own book, and it also is in whisper sync, so you can buy the Kindle and the audio book, and it will follow right along with you on your Kindle. That's a new feature with Amazon.
Well, Dave, all the links will be in the show notes for this episode. I really want to I appreciate your time, sir, and like I said, thank you very much for being on the podcast.
Joe, it's been a pleasure, and would be happy to do this anytime. Thank you.
Thank you.